This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by democracy at work. So let me begin with the very simple observation that the dynamics of capital accumulation are heavily dependent upon consumer activity, consumer confidence. In fact, it is said that about 70% or more of the impulse towards economic growth really resides with the consumer. So anything that interferes with the activities of consumption is threatening to the dynamics of accumulation. And final consumption is the main thing we're going to look at this particular point. I've mentioned that tourism is just the cutting edge of the sorts of impacts which the virus can have upon consumer activity. Nobody is going to be flying, and the tourist industry of northern Italy is dead right now. The tourist industry in much of Asia is in difficulty, and many people are nervous about being involved in tourism, given the kind of imaginaries which are required for the tourist industry to survive. You watch some of the television commercials, and there are two kinds of commercials. One is people going and living on the beaches and the like. It's about bananas and beaches, as Cynthia Enlow talks about it. It's about sort of the sea, sun, sex and sand, which is the kind of way in which a lot of the fantasy of the perfect holiday works. Tourism is a form of what I would call compensatory consumerism. And compensatory consumerism, because in the theory of alienation, which I would work with, we would argue that people are alienated in their work. They're alienated very frequently by the chores of their daily life. And so you try to compensate for that by offering forms of consumerism, which are a kind of pleasurable release, happy moments, and so you sell the fantasy of the tourist holiday and the wonderful kind of time you might have as a sort of release from the misery and chores of daily life. So tourism plays upon that fantasy, advertises that fantasy. And of course, it advertises this in various contexts, the beach obviously being one of them. But another one of them is the tourist cruise, the big cruise liners. And you see advertisements for that. Well, now we've had two cruise liners that have been stuck with people with contaminated, and people with been turned into a nightmare. So the imaginary of what the tourist life is about is seriously affected. The result is that tourism has taken a huge hit. And tourism is a very serious part of global economy right now. And to the degree that it's taking a huge hit, we're going to have many of the companies which are involved in it, all of the airlines, I think, are going to have serious difficulties over time. And people are going to actually kind of worry that whether they will ever want to get back to that nightmare cruise liner, whether they will ever want to get back to the threat that comes with being contaminated by in some tourist resort. But then there is daily life, and I've mentioned many of the ways in which contemporary consumption is organized. Of course, one of the ways is through collective events, through festivals, through film festivals, through music festivals, through soccer matches and the like. And we suddenly start to see many of these events being cancelled. In Italy, for example, the big soccer games are now played in empty stadia. We now see many other things going on. We start to see schools closed. We start to see universities closed. We see cultural institutions closed. The Louvre was closed in Paris. So we can't go to those things anymore. And that means that the income stream, which is coming out of people's revenues, which flows to all of those things, starts to get disrupted. And the whole lifestyle that we develop and has been developed over the last 20 or 30 years to promote certain kinds of consumerism, that lifestyle starts to be disrupted. Now, the same thing happens on, if you like, almost a daily basis. How much do we eat out? How much do we live by takeout food? I, for example, up until about 5-6 years ago, I rarely ever had any takeout food. I would eat out, but in recent years, I've taken to eating out much more and a lot of takeout food. Well, I used to cook my own food, but now I use takeout. But now I'm not going to use takeout anymore. I've got food at home and I'm going to cook at home. I'm not going to eat out because I'm in the high-risk category, given my age, of actually being killed by this virus. So I want to avoid, as much as I can, putting myself in harm's way by going to any of these large events, to going to a restaurant, to even having takeout food. So I will cook the food at home and I will eat at home. And actually, I always used to do that. And frankly, I will brag, if you like, a little bit by saying that generally speaking, the quality of food I have at home is better than that which I have outside, and generally speaking, it's better than the takeout. So I can, I enjoy cooking, so I'm going to stay at home and I'm going to cook. And maybe I'll have a couple of friends over, and we'll sort of share that way. I'll cook one night, somebody else will cook another night. We may do that, but this is a complete transformation of lifestyle, and I think that bit by bit, as things start to change, and as, for instance, schools close down, people find themselves. We're going to find ourselves in changing lifestyle, but beyond that, there is also the problem that all of those activities which I was engaged on, for example, eating out and going to cultural events and so on, if they are closed down, then the people who are employed in production of those events are going to lose their positions and lose their jobs, and suddenly we're going to find, let's suppose everybody does what I propose to do, which is to cook at home, then what's going to happen to all the delivery boys that are out there? What's going to happen to Grubhub? What's going to happen to all of the organized takeouts? So the lifestyle of many people is going to change. We're not going to travel as much. I am certainly not going to go through airports, and I'm certainly not going to go sit in an airplane for 4 or 5 hours. So I'm going to stay at home. I'm going to cook for myself. I mean, in other words, you can see the situation, but that means that capital accumulation is not going to be able to go on in the way it's gone on before, on the form of consumerism that had been constructed. And to the degree that that happens, then there's going to be widespread and increasing unemployment of large segments of the population. And to the degree that there's unemployment, then we're going to find there's even less demand in the final product. In other words, we're likely to find ourselves in a downward spiral of demand, that as final demand contracts, so there will be unemployment, which will lead to a further contraction of final demand, and we will get into a downward spiral, which is, I think, one of the things that people are beginning to see happening. So not only are we beginning to see corporations which rely upon productive consumption getting into trouble, we're going to find all of those corporations and all of those sectors of the economy which are about support of final consumption, getting into serious difficulty because people will not have the money. And as they do not have the money, so will start to find that they cannot afford to pay their rent, they cannot afford to pay their mortgage, and so we're going to see a sort of a decline in housing capacity. So here is a situation where the decline in effective demand and the effective demand that comes from certain forms of consumerism, that decline in effective demand is going to generate a serious long-term crisis unless we're very, very careful. Now, the form of crisis, which was a classic form of this sort, was that, of course, of the 1930s, which many people would now look upon as fundamentally a crisis of lack of effective demand. And, of course, the Keynesian solution was we get out of it by government deficit financing, a huge investment, and particularly in terms of the built environment, which is something, by the way, which China did in 2007, 2008. And as I've argued elsewhere, one of the reasons we didn't get into a major crisis in 2007, 2008 had everything to do with the fact that the Chinese launched this huge investment in infrastructures, urbanization, high-speed rail networks, new container ports and all the rest of it. And that investment created a huge demand for product. Now, at this point, the question is, where will we find something of that kind? The Chinese can't possibly do this again, even though they're going to do some of it, clearly, as they come out of the crisis in Wuhan. But what's going to happen in the rest of the world? And we have this bizarre thing happened recently, that the crisis that began to be felt throughout the whole kind of economic structure about 10 or 15 days ago, that crisis was addressed by a cut in interest rates. Now, this is a bizarre moment, okay? The crisis is you've got a virus which is expanding and is taking grip of larger segments of the world and is diffusing and threatens to break out of any containment strategies, and it's going to take a year or so, or more at least, before we get any kind of antidote to it. So we have all of that going on, and the counter to it is to cut the interest rate. Now, doesn't this strike you as completely bizarre? That the answer to the spread of this virus is to cut the interest rate. Well, the mediating thing is that supposedly the cut in the interest rate is something which can be engineered by the central banks. And increasingly, over the last 30 years, there has been a reluctance on the part of government, with the exception, of course, of China, to use fiscal policies, that is, expansionary fiscal policies, which will deal with the problems of demand. Increasingly, what we've seen is that the monetary policies, that is, the Federal Reserve, is the one that's supposed to take care of it. The Federal Reserve cannot take care of this crisis. The cut on the interest rate the other day by the U.S. Federal Reserve didn't really do anything, had no impact whatsoever. Another cut won't do anything either, and you're close to zero anyway, so you can't go any further with that. What there has to be is some coordinated response to try to revitalize demand, and that will then lead to a whole set of interventions in the economy, which the state, given the way in which the right wing has looked at it, is reluctant to engage in. For example, one of the ways in which you could do something is to set up something like a universal basic income. And you don't have to do it on a permanent basis. You could do it by simply, and this happened once before, back in 2007, 2008, by the way, when everybody was giving $1,000 to kind of spend. So you've got to jack up consumption somehow or other, because consumption, but then the question is, what do you spend that $1,000 on? Are you going to spend it on a tourist activity? No, you're not going to do that. Tourism, I think, has taken a permanent hit. So we've got to think about other forms of consumerism. And what might they be? Well, as we get more and more unemployment, we're going to find people are going to not actually be able to buy basic foodstuffs. So you're going to have to deal with the basic needs of a population, either by unemployment benefits or by kind of saying, well, everybody below a certain level in the tax bracket is going to receive a monthly stipend until this crisis is over. So there may be issues of that kind, which gives an opportunity to kind of start to say, look, capitalism is plainly not working, and it's not working well at all, and that therefore one of the things we have to start to do is to restructure the economy around a completely different set of possibilities. And I think that, for me anyway, I can survive reasonably well, and given my class position and the fact that my salary continues to come in, I'm in a very privileged position in relationship to this crisis compared to the people in the gig economy who are very dependent upon the kind of activities of Grubhub and all the rest of it. So, and that's where you're going to start to find mass unemployment occurring and mass distress. And there's going to have to be a mass response to that mass unemployment and that mass distress. And that mass response then starts to say, well, the state has to step in, and they start to actually set up basic provisioning. I will get in trouble when I go to the store and find not only that some of my favorite goods have disappeared, but I just cannot find some basics. Let's suppose I go to the store and I say, okay, I'm going to cook my own meals and all the rest of it, but I go to the store and I find there are no onions, or I find there are no vegetables, or I find there's no meat. I find there's no anything of that kind. In other words, when the stores become empty, then I am in trouble too, because I will not be able to survive. At that point, you have to start to sort of say, all right, we need to go back to a basic provisioning of the population. How is that going to be done, and in what ways will that be done? In other words, there's going to be some element of social planning which is going to have to be introduced into the situation to take care of the fact that nobody's going to go rushing back into the kind of consumerism which underpins the cruises, or underpins the tourism, and underpins all of these forms of consumerism, like the big festivals and all the rest of it. So right now we're in this situation where a lot of forms of consumption which have been built up over the last 30 or 40 years are redundant in the face of the virus. The virus is attacking those forms of consumerism. And to the degree that those forms of consumerism are conspicuous consumption, and in some ways are monstrous forms of consumerism, and then it seems to me that this is an opportunity in which we can rethink the qualities of daily life and start to think about how to finance and organize and orchestrate daily life. In other words, you're going to need some kind of socialist planning. You're going to need social democratic kind of forms of governance. In other words, neoliberalism is not going to work at all in the face of this virus. This virus requires a completely different, at least social democratic, centralized planning response. And this is, if you like, why I would argue that the virus is helping us to think further about the nature of anti-capitalist politics, because the capitalist system cannot actually cannot cope with events of this kind very satisfactorily and very adequately. But then the history comes back in, because what we see is that since the 1960s, again and again, we've had articles of incidents of this kind. And what happens is everybody gets concerned, like SARS or bird flu or swine fever or whatever it is. Everybody gets concerned and upset, and we start to develop an infrastructure which can actually be prepared to handle incidents of this kind. And then the incident goes away because the viruses kind of exhaust themselves and disappear. But then they come back again. And what we saw was with SARS or Ebola and so on, we started to build a capacity to deal with things like that. And then they weren't around. And so we cut and we cut and we cut. And so we cut the Centers for Disease Control. We cut all our preparedness. And as a result, when this comes back, and we didn't even prepare for it when the Chinese gave us a whole month because we just thought, oh, well, it's another SARS and it doesn't matter. Well, this one is different from SARS, and it does matter, and it's plainly going to have effects. And right now, it's have been big effects upon the profitability of enterprises. It's having effects upon large segments of the economy. Many of those sectors of the economy are going to suffer not only serious drawdowns of profitability, but they may end up being actually bankrupted or foreclosed upon. So here we have a situation where a crisis in the metabolic relation to nature spills over into the total circulation process of capital with proliferating effects right throughout the whole kind of economic system, to the point where it actually then invites us to start to invent new mechanisms and new possibilities for creating an alternative form of social and political life. And in this regard, there's one other point I would want to make. People become acculturated to doing things in certain ways. We've become acculturated to certain things in people around me, and in New York City. I would say the sort of Grubhub, takeout, dining out kind of way of living has become hegemonic, but now it's been stopped. And now we're adopting other forms of living. And actually, I'm enjoying cooking. And maybe people can enjoy cooking and cooking at home and socializing at home. And maybe this is this cultural transformation. People would kind of say, well, actually, I don't know about that whole style of life. I wasn't really enjoying it as much as I wanted to. And maybe we'll find different ways to set up our daily lives, which are much more satisfying and much more interesting. This is an opportunity as well as a moment of fear and dread. It is an opportunity, and we therefore have to think about the virus and thank the virus for its anti-capitalist instincts. I think that it's helpful to us, and I think we should try to take advantage of it, not in an opportunistic sense, but in a sense of kind of saying there's got to be a long-term transformation. That whole kind of structure that I've been talking about of exponential growth forever, endless capital accumulation forever, cannot continue. And the form of consumerism that was consistent with that is vulnerable and is showing itself to be very vulnerable right now. So now we should start to think a bit more clearly about ways to build an anti-capitalist social system. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.